I'm Ryan. I am not with ProMusic, but I'm from the music industry. I decided about 2 years ago to do a study on user-centric and alternative models, payment models for music streaming, and thankfully ProMusic agreed that this is a very important topic, so we did this study together. I myself done a couple of things within the music industry. I've led a team at Sony Music in Germany for data analytics and business intelligence. I then went to New York to Sony Music's offices there, and among other things, worked for about 6 months on analyzing the impact of user-centric. And for now, more than 1.5 years, I've been almost full-time looking into this, analyzing it. And now, since 6 months, I'm with BMG, the label and music publisher. I'm Senior Director for YouTube Business Development. So still in the streaming space, in the music recorded industry, but also publishing. All right, I want to share with you who we've talked with about this topic throughout this journey. So we've been talking to associations for copyright, music managers. We've talked to lobbyist organizations, associations that represent the streaming services in Germany, but also in the UK and in Washington. We've talked to all of the familiar associations in Germany, but also some in the UK and internationally. And we were in touch with basically all of the relevant streaming services. So a lot of people, a lot of organizations, a lot of companies are talking about alternative payment models, and it is a highly relevant topic for 2023. All right, so the goal I set myself today, and it's an ambitious one, is on the agenda of talking points for musicians, also songwriters. What I want to happen, what I want to convince you of today is do not talk, I'm not going to talk about per stream rates, but just, you have to take it by my word, don't talk about per stream rates predominantly. What really matters for the income in streaming is the payment models. There's also topics like how much should people pay for a subscription service and so on, also important. But I truly believe the payment models is the most important things that artists and people within the industry, songwriters included obviously, should talk about all the time. So what is a payment model? Because I'm not sure everybody is familiar with what that definition is. So this is a very simple overview of how the money flows within music streaming. It's about how much subscribers pay into pay streaming services and the overall revenue that comes in. Then, after taxes and so on, the streaming services keep some money for themselves. And then the rest of the money they pay out to rights holders, to artists, songwriters, publishers. And that's what we're going to look at. We're not going to look at how much our labels and publishers are going to share with their artists and publishing clients. So we're going to look at how the money paid out by streaming services to the rights holders is going to be split, allocated among our artists. And that's the important part of what we mean with payment model. So what is the current payment model? How is all the money that comes in music streaming split among artists? It's called pro rata. What it is we're paying out based on an artist's share of total streams on the platform. So for example, on Spotify. So if you have 1% of all the streams on Spotify, this is obviously almost impossible to achieve, but just as an example, if you have 1% of all streams on Spotify, you get 1% of all the subscription revenue that is paid out to your label and so on. So all of the money goes in one big account, one pool, one pie of revenue, and whatever share of total streams you have, that's the share, the piece of the pie that you get as an artist. So what is the problem? Why is it so important to talk about the way this pool is split? And I'm going to go with a very extreme example, but it's like kind of gets the blood flowing and creates some emotions. Is anyone of you familiar with the artist Granular? Anybody show by hands if you heard of Granular? Which is not surprising. These are the two most important, most streamed tracks from Granular. I'm going to perform them. Track A goes like this. Track B goes like this. Right? White noise track A, white noise track B. How many streams do you think on Spotify that these tracks have since release? Any guess? Yell out your guess. No guesses? I'll tell you. 610 for white noise track A, 490 for white noise track B. The thing is, this is millions. So those two white noise tracks in total generated 1.1 billion streams on Spotify since release. Anybody know how many streams Michael Jackson's Beat It got on Spotify? I'm going to tell you that too. It's 0.9 billion streams. So I'll go back. That number is too small for you to see, but Granular has about 480,000 monthly listeners on Spotify. Michael Jackson, or his profile, has 36 million. Granular has 4,000 followers. Michael Jackson's profile has 27 million. So what we're doing now, the way we allocate revenue, is based on streams, but not based on listeners, which is a factor of 1 to 72, and not based on whatever you want to call that, valuation conversion to followers, which is a factor of, so Michael Jackson's profile has 6,750 times the followers of Granular. Still, more streams just for those two tracks than Beat It, and overall about the same number of revenue under pro rata. So the big question is total streams the ideal way to measure success within music streaming? Is it the way to represent what listeners value, what the demand is, and should we thereby allocate revenue based on this metric alone? That's the essential question. So how relevant is this topic? I mentioned who we talked to, but just like some examples, the Broken Record campaign has talked about user-centric. There's been other campaigns, fixed streaming, just as at Spotify. In Germany, there was the Fair Share initiative a couple of years back, talked about that. The British Parliament has done an investigation into music streaming, and payment models were a part of this. Deezer has advocated for it for years. Tidal said it would implement user-centric, although they stopped that. But SoundCloud has started its fan-powered royalties, which is a user-centric model. And they have Warner Music on board as the first major to experiment in this field. This is Kim Bailey. She's CEO of ERA, which is the basically lobbying organization for streaming services in the UK. And she said that we need to be not only open-minded about user-centric, but actually do the homework on what its impact would be. This is Garrett Levin, the CEO of the DEMA, the global lobbying organization for the streaming services, also said we should further explore alternative payment models. So everyone's talking about it. My point today is try to convince any artist and songwriter that this is something they need to talk about any day in the future. Okay, so a lot of folks talking about user-centric. What is it? As opposed to the current model, pro rata. the money is paid out not based on your stream share of total streams on the platform, but your share of streams for every user. So while you have on a pro rata one pool and one share, like 1%, with User-Centric, for every user, there's one pool of money. So if you have 10% of user X's streams, as an artist, you get 10% of that subscription revenue. If you have 25% of user Y, you get that. If you don't have streams from another user, obviously you don't get any revenue from that user. So that's, in very simple terms, the difference between pro rata and user-centric. Why should an artist and a songwriter, I'm talking a lot about artists, but the same thing is true for songwriters, why should they care about payment model and user-centric? There are a lot of other important things in streaming. There is, as I said before, how much do people pay for subscription revenues, how much does Spotify keep for themselves, how much do labels pay out, and so on and so forth. What they have in common is it's a little bit more revenue, 5%, maybe 10%, 15% for all artists. And the unique thing about a new payment model like user-centric is, and this is basically new, there's been other studies on this topic, and this is something that hasn't been shown really. User-centric and other payment models can create a lot more revenue for certain artists, but at the cost of others. Other artists, other profiles like Granular, you always need to think about there's not only music and artists on a streaming platform. So what can user-centric, in this case, do for artists? If we're talking about the overall impact of such a new payment model, that's actually effectively been unanswered to date. And it's really important because it would not only change what you earn as an artist, it would basically change everything from songwriting to producing to marketing, even A&Ring. And such a huge change only makes sense if there's, in fact, really, a big change through that payment model. Gonna go a little bit quickly through this. There's been a French study from the Centre National de la Musique. One of their outcomes was that they say there's €8 per year more on average for mid-sized and smaller artists, which is basically nothing. It'd be 2 coffees here at the fair, and that's it. And there's been a smaller study, not so much discussed, with the University of Hamburg and Kühne Logistics. They estimated $170 million would be redistributed among the artists, but globally for Spotify. First thing, based on our study, we think the French study, that top €8 is misleading. And the second study, we think, is underestimating the actual impact of a user-centric payment model. What our data shows, and we have a data set from SoundCloud. What that data shows is that potentially 25% of all subscription revenue would be moved around from certain artists to other artists, from certain profiles to other profiles. So we're talking in Germany alone, based on the current revenues, we're talking about more than 160 million in Germany alone. So if it's 25% for Spotify, Apple Music as well, we only know it for SoundCloud, but if that were the case, we could be easily talking about more than $1 billion being moved around. So really significant impact. The interesting thing then from an artist's point of view is, okay, there's a lot happening, a lot of change. What does that mean for you personally as an artist? Would you as an artist get more revenue? And so what our study finds is that almost 1 in 3 artists would get 40% more revenue from streaming at minimum. And it's 19%, almost 1 in 5 artists would double their streaming income under a user-centric model, is what our study suggests. But, and this I mentioned before, there's also about 1 in 3 artists, actually almost 39%, that would lose 40% or more. So that creates questions, obviously. I'm going to summarize this just for now. Significant impact overall, but also individually for many artists. That significant impact can be positive or negative, but there's a good chance that you as an artist could benefit, could get significantly more income. That chance is 1 in 3. We're going to talk about that a little bit more going on, but the central questions are, basically, if you want to change the model, a lot is happening. Will that impact not only be huge, but will it be favorable? I don't like the term fair that much, but will it in some way be better, preferable to pro rata? So what you need to answer to find a position towards that is, if you benefit, why? If you would get more into user-centric, why is that? And on a more general level, what types of artists and artist profiles would benefit from user-centric? So one main part, like the heart of this study, is not only proving that it would be a huge impact, that's one thing. The other thing is figuring out whether that's good or bad and how you can answer that question. So you need to know who, or based on what, is that money going to be allocated, and this is a core part of the study. So these are the characteristics that determine, we identified 3 of those that determine whether an artist or an artist profile would benefit or not. And if you perform well across these characteristics, User-Centric will reward you with more revenue. The first factor that determines whether an artist would get more or less under User-Centric we call relative user reach. That is not the overall monthly listeners that you have, but it's your listeners or your users in relation to your streams. I got an easy example on this. So artist A has 10 million streams. Artist B also has 10 million streams. Right now under pro rata, they get the same amount of revenue, just like Michael Jackson and Granular. But artist A has 100,000 users and artist B has 2 million users. Artist A therefore has a relative user reach of 10. They reach 10 users per 1,000 streams. Artist B reaches 200 listeners per 1,000 streams. So when streams are equal, user-generated would reward artists that reach more listeners at the same time. That's factor one. So, and we want to help with this study, any artist, songwriter, anyone within the music industry to find a position towards user-centric, because right now, based on all the research and so on, you're still unable to do that. There's a lot of questions that are unanswered. So what we do is we translate these factors into questions that you can try to answer. And that is the question, does that sound favorable? Does that make sense? If 2 artists have the same number of streams, 2 profiles have the same number of streams, should the artist or the profile that has more listeners be financially rewarded and get more revenue? So this is the first incentive that User-Centric would put in place. So, and this is really important. So under pro rata, all that counts today is the number of streams, no matter how many listeners, no matter anything else, that's all. Under User-Centric, you additionally need to reach users, or you are rewarded for more users. So this is a second incentive that will be put in place. I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly. The point I want to make on this slide is, so for you not to think we're pulling this out of thin air, but this is actually based in math and data. So we're just going to show a little bit how the correlation between these factors and the financial impact on artists is. So we have here, these are 10% of all of the artists in the SoundCloud data set. they on average reach only a few listeners in relation to their streams. And then on the other scale, we have artists that have a higher relative user reach. And if you look at the average impact through user-centric on their revenues, you can see that the 10 that don't reach a lot of listeners relatively will lose about a third of their revenue on average. And the more users you reach, the better the impact would be. All right. I said I'm going a bit quickly through this. I don't want to bore you with the numbers, but this is another visualization basically showing how user-centric reallocates revenue. So the gray area is the pro rata revenue, and the blue area is the user-centric revenue, and you can see how it moves revenue from artists with low user reach to artists with more user reach. So this is a visualization of how revenue would be allocated by user-centric based on relative user reach. I'm going to have another example. I know we touched on white noise already, but a granular is not the only one. This is Spotify popularity from 0 to 100. And you got also having the lullaby, you got crime stories, you got nature sounds. They're all in the same popularity range than, for example, Good Charlotte, Jose Gonzalez, Tony Braxton, and many others. So they are, in terms of streams, equally popular on Spotify. If you look at the monthly listeners they have on Spotify, however, you see the familiar names on top, and you see that these artists or profiles have significantly low users. So those nature sounds and so on, having the lullaby would be on the left, and what user-centric would do is move money to the right to artists that reach more listeners. All right, that was the first factor, the first incentive put in place by user-centric. The second one, and the most important one, is an artist's average user commitment, is what we call it. That is your stream share averaged across all of your listeners. Again, an example, you got user A, and the artist has 100 streams, gets 100 streams from that user. You got another artist also getting 100 streams from a different user. So equal streams, equal revenue under the current model. The difference is, though, the first user has 100 streams in total. That means this user commits 100% of the streams to that artist, whereas the other user in this example has 1,000 streams in total, so the user commitment to that artist is only 10%. So, and with user-centric, when streams are equal, it rewards artists whose users listen to less other music, to less other stuff. That's what it does. So again, we're going to translate that into the question, does that sound favorable? Does that make sense? Should the artist that enjoys higher exclusivity among its users receive more revenue? And this is the second incentive that user-centric would put in place. Again, do this quickly. We have artist profiles with low user commitment. So there are profiles that only have a commitment of 0.5%, meaning on average their listeners only listen to them for less than 1%, and 99.5% of their consumption is for other artists. But at the other end of the scale, you have artist profiles where their users on average listen to them, almost a third of their consumption is for those artists specifically. So there's huge differences between artists and profiles on streaming services. And user-centric would factor that in where pro rata today does not. And you can see if there are artists that have very low user commitment, they would lose almost 80% of their revenue on average. And if you have, in this case for SoundCloud, 12% average commitment, you would get 140% more revenue on average. All right, I'll just skip through this. Again, we have the visualization. User-centric moves The gray area, again, is pro rata revenue, the current revenue. User-Centric moves the money away from artists and profiles with low user commitment to artists with high commitment. Okay, the third factor, well, there's three: the relative user reach, the average user commitment, and then there's the average user spend. And that is how much an artist's users pay for their subscription service. So if your listeners pay more in subscription services into a streaming service, that would be rewarded under User-Centric, whereas it's not rewarded at the moment under pro rata. Very simple example: one artist, one user, €6. Another artist, same user commitment, €8. Obviously, artist B would be rewarded more than the first artist. So when everything else is equal, in this case, if the user commitment is equal, for example, both have 20% of that user's share, you would be rewarded if that user pays in more revenue. Same question: does that make sense in your eyes? Should the artist whose users are willing to pay more into the system be financially rewarded for reaching those users, potentially pulling them on to the streaming service? And that's the third incentive. And so I don't know if you like math or not, but like just as FYI, these three factors explain we have about 50,000 artists in the data set. They explain 97% of all of the impact. So this is what matters. There's been studies talking about genre impact, what would happen for rap music, what would happen for classical music, jazz, and so on. There are differences between genres, but what really matters are these factors. And if, for example, rap indexes low and loses more money on average, it's because they perform poorly along these three factors. So either they have low relative user reach, they have low user commitment, or they have a low user spend on average. Okay, we're going to do this quick. Same thing. User-Centric would move money away from artists that reach lower paying subscribers and move it to artists whose listeners are paying more. All right, so back to the underlying question. The question of what payment model should we have, should pro rata be changed, in what way, is about how we measure success. That's one way to express it. Another way is to say, well, what is the best way to represent what fans, what listeners, what subscribers value, and what the demand is. So the question is, again, does pro rata, the current model, tell us a lot or anything about the real demand and the real value? And then what should be financially rewarded? And so this is, in fact, and I believe it's the first time the whole music community needs to get together and figure this out, because when you paid for a record, you could charge the price for that record that you wanted or needed, and you would get the money, and that was it. You were independent for everything. Now, there's this big pool of money, and if somebody else gets more streams, you get less revenue. So it's a completely different situation. It's the first time we need to figure out how to distribute a pool of revenue. Maybe not the first time, but the first time for such a huge part of the business and part of artists' income. And everyone in the industry needs to find a position towards user-centric or other models. And the question is, what set of incentives do we need to put in place to enable the creation of valuable music and content? Because if we don't measure it the right way, and we send money into places where there's actually no demand, artists and companies are going to produce music that is not in demand, but produces a lot of revenue. So this is, in my view, really very important discussion we finally need to have within the industry. And we're hoping that these three factors, these three characteristics and incentives that we identified help everyone in the industry to start having this conversation. And so the basic logic is, if you find all these three factors and these incentives favorable, you think they make sense, this is something that should be or does represent value and demand, in theory, you should be pro-user-centric in this case. If you don't agree with one or all of them or partly disagree, you might be against it. But this is the starting point for the conversation that needs to be held everywhere in the industry and wherever artists talk to each other as well. Of course, there's a lot of beyond the pure financial impact on day one when you would flip the switch to another payment model. There's a lot of practical consequences, and I hinted at that before. If suddenly you don't only need to produce a lot of streams, but you also need to have more listeners, you have two things that you want to achieve, for example, in marketing, or if you're signing artists, you need artists that don't just produce a lot of streams in a certain group or target audience or demographic. You also need to think about how to grow that from day one of a release. All right, so what can an artist do to take part in this conversation? Of course, it's the starting point. Come here to hear me talk, read the study. We're gonna release it in a matter of days and or at least a couple of weeks. You're gonna try to understand the incentives, what they would mean. But if you come to the conclusion that this is important for you, you need to engage your partners. That means if you have a label, if you have a management, if you have anybody that has a voice that can represent you, ask them to assist and actively represent you in terms of payment models. Of course, as a single artist, there might be a handful of artists that can really talk to this publicly, but most artists obviously can't. So what you need to do is go to your label, and hopefully we'll get to a situation where a lot of artists at a label or a management company come to them, so the company decides to take it to the next level. And our study, I believe, has a lot of interesting and relevant insights. However, if an artist wants to know what really they would earn not only on SoundCloud, but for example on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, and so ever, what you need, of course, is the data, you need the information, you need the transparency. I know this is always a topic, transparency, and it seems hard to achieve. What I mean by this is go to your partners and say, I want you to go to the streaming services and say, I want our artists to know what they would earn under user-centric or different models. So if you think and you or the artist has a right to know how this money can be split, then you should ask your partners to claim it. Because what the study shows is it's possible to calculate. It's not that hard. All you need is the commitment and the willingness at the end of the day from the streaming services, but they won't necessarily decide on their own, but it needs people to say, we'll do it. And I personally think if we're talking about such an amount of revenue, and it's so important for the livelihoods of artists and whether they can make music or not, and I believe they have a right to know what the options are and what it would mean for their finances. Okay, so back to the goal. Again, I don't know if you were talking about per stream rates. Certainly a lot of artists still are, a lot of folks even at labels in the industry. I didn't talk about it much today. Just take my word for it. It has no financial impact at all. It does not matter. It's a fictional calculation that depends on a number of factors. It's not important. What this is about is how all this money that's coming in, this growing pool of revenue, is split and what the rules are that guard that. Again, there's also other important topics. Should we charge more? Should there be inflation finally be represented in a higher streaming service. That's all important. But the thing is, if you don't solve the way you distribute revenue by pouring more money into that pool, you're just going to make the problem even bigger. So you need to solve the way to allocate revenue first, or at the same time, ideally. All right, I got some takeaways. This is not news, obviously. Premium streaming is, for most artists, for many artists, the biggest source of revenue. User-centric and potentially other models can produce the highest increase in revenue compared to basically everything else that's been talked about. And this is something new because, again, the French study said, and a lot of people have read that in the industry and some artists, and they still believe user-centric will only create €8 more per year. And it's very important to basically get it into everybody's head that payment model impact, user-centric impact, is not marginal. It can be substantial. As shown with the SoundCloud data, it could be 25%. That number, by the way, is across 5 major music markets. It could be even as high as 33% of all subscription revenues in Sweden, for example, or even 43% in Portugal. So more than 40% of all subscription revenue could be moved around, you know, as I showed on the graphs before. Yeah, make this a priority with fellow artists. I would love to see, you know, a lot of artists picking this up, trying to discuss it, maybe based on the insights of the study. I know it's complicated, and the challenge is how to break this down and how to give artists and everyone in this industry a path forward, not only to understand, but also what can you do to take part in the conversation. So, and I believe, look, I've worked at different labels, including major labels. I've advocated for certain things for months and months, and until the artists, you know, come to the boss of the record label, sit on the couch and say, I want this, do it, a lot of things are not going to happen. But when that happens, that's when, you know, labels start to think. And labels are part of this discussion, streaming services are, and labels are good partners if you get them on board that can talk to the streaming services. Also, this is more like general things, but important for context. I have alluded to this before, but there are more options than user-centric. The user-centric model that we're looking at, that everybody's been looking at, that SoundCloud have implemented, is a very specific kind of user-centric. It still counts streams and counts streams that are cut at 30 seconds. Any stream that's longer than 30 seconds, like a 40-second stream, counts the same as an 8-minute stream. It's still counting streams that way. And there's obviously, you know, a lot of people are talking or requesting the actual listening time, so essentially seconds to be counted. And you could do a user-centric based on listening time. Another suggestion that has been floated in different conversations is, do you want to separate active consumption from lean back consumption? You know, what playlist consumption versus album, or if you search for an artist, do you want to factor that differently? Is an album stream, for example, twice or 4 times as relevant in terms that it represents demand than a playlist stream or something that you're listening while you're working or sleeping, for example? So you could do a user-centric payment model with listening time with different factors for active and passive listening. So there's a lot of different things. It doesn't have to be user-centric, but all these things need to come to the table, and it needs to be explained to artists, and it needs to be shown to them what the impact is, and you know, we need to enable artists to have the conversation. Alternative payment models, just to reiterate again, are about how value and success are measured, what artists are incentivized for. And again, you cannot underestimate what kind of change that is. Another example is in Germany, we have a value-based chart system. In other countries, you do not. So we're still counting stuff. And if you have a user-centric, if there's a user extreme example that has one stream in a month and pays 10 euros, that stream is worth 10 euros. There'll be deductions. Streaming service will take their cut. At the end, it's about 5 euros to 5.60. That goes to the label and then to the artist. But all of the streaming revenue from that user will go to an artist based on one stream. Another user that has 1,000 streams, that stream will be worth the subscription fee divided by 1,000. So there's no correlation between streams, amount of streams, and revenue anymore, which means counting streams doesn't make any sense. So, awards that you will be presenting to people working somewhere based on hundreds of thousands or a couple of million streams will not make any sense because they don't translate into revenue. That's just one example of how big of a change of the mindset it would be, and very important. And as I said, again, right now, because you have pro rata, what you do as an artist or producer, if you think about money, you cut your track short. I know so many artists, DJs, producers that say, I know I need to produce white noise, I need to do piano sounds 1.5 minutes for people while they're working. Every day artists are making these decisions, producers, songwriters are making these decisions, but not only them, even the major labels, and I said this when I worked for Sony Music, I said, every company, including the biggest companies, will need to invest in the content that makes money. Otherwise, you can choose not to, but then you'll lose revenue, you'll lose market share. And now you need to optimize for short tracks, for background listening, for a lot of streams of a core young audience. That's how it works right now. If you change to user-centric, it's totally different. Suddenly, if, for example, older demographics pay the highest subscription fees, if they only stream 100 times in a month, if you get 10% of those streams, it's a lot of revenue. And you can get potentially more out of these users, and for the first time in history, or for a very long time, it would make sense to create frontline content for older audiences. Whereas now, or for the last, 100 years, it's been focused very much on a young demographic. So it's going to change A&Ring, it's going to change decisions on an individual artist level, but everywhere else as well. Okay, last point I want to make. This is thinking a bit further, but some people right now say, well, we're going to think about what happens after this premium music streaming. This is not the most innovative model. Maybe it will go away. Maybe that will happen. The point is, which is a very interesting thing, the payment models are not only relevant for the Spotify, SoundCloud, Deezer, and so on. There's only one case where you don't need to think about a payment model, which is if I pay my money to you specifically, then everything's fine. I don't need a payment model. But if the two of you make music, I pay a company $10 and it needs to pay out, decide who of you gets how much based on data, then you need a payment model. It has nothing to do with streaming necessarily. So, for example, a lot of future revenue streams, if you have a more futuristic but not so futuristic example, you have a festival island in the metaverse. Epic Games just announced the Creator Fund, where they're going to measure engagement on an island, and they're going to share 40% of their revenue with whoever runs the island, and then they'll figure out how to pay the rights holders that produce the content, for example, music. So You could do it the pro rata way and just say, well, if somebody shows up for 5 minutes and listens to a seagull in the background while he's walking on the beach during a break from the festival, that counts the same as being at a concert for 2 hours. You can do it the pro rata way, or you pose the question, well, what do we measure and what represents the value? How do we allocate revenue? Another important point, another important thing to point out. Okay, so I was 10 seconds late, but that's not bad. I think we would have, if you want to ask questions, I know I got like, what, 6 people in the audience, and I'm see how many questions you got, but you will have to go to the microphone, unfortunately, but I'll invite you to ask questions if you have. I'm very happy to answer them. If not, that's okay. Thank you for attending. I hope this was worth your while, and again, start talking about it even if it feels complicated at first. Thank you very much.